When the veil fell. A story of Leon Noble and Chelsea Potter. Some men walk into a room and command it. Leon Noble walked into every room like he owned the building, which, in most cases, he did. Cold. Precise. A man built from steel and silence. He had brokered deals across 3 continents, dismantled rivals with surgical efficiency, and never once lost sleep over a decision. Not a single one. Until the morning his lawyer slid a 32-year-old contract across the desk and told him he was obligated to marry a woman he had never met. He agreed. Not because his heart stirred, it did not. Not because he saw the photograph and felt anything. He did not. He agreed because $47 billion in joint assets was not a number a man walks away from without consequence, and Leon Noble had not built everything he had built by making sentimental choices. He told himself it was a contract. Clean. Executable. Temporary in the ways that mattered. He told himself he would manage it the way he managed everything. With control, with structure, with an exit already mapped before the thing even began. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. On the morning of the wedding, standing at the altar of a stone cathedral in Boston with his hands folded in front of him and his jaw set with the particular composure of a man prepared for business, Leon Noble lifted a veil made of French lace and stopped. Not hesitated. Not paused. Stopped. The way a man stops when the universe casually rearranges itself around him without asking for permission first. Because the woman beneath the veil was not the woman in the photograph. Or rather, she was. But the photograph had lied. And the man who never missed a detail had missed the most important one of all. What happens when the most controlled man in the world meets the one person he cannot control? What happens when the contract designed to be managed quietly becomes the most disorienting chapter of an otherwise perfectly ordered life? This is that story. And it starts with a veil, and a moment, and a man who will spend the next several months discovering that being wrong can be the most extraordinary thing that ever happens to a person. Chapter 1. The Contract. The document had been sitting on Leon Noble's desk for 11 days. Not because he hadn't read it. He had, twice, with the same detached efficiency he brought to acquisition briefs and merger agreements, but because what it contained was so fundamentally absurd that some rational part of him kept waiting for his legal team to confirm it was a forgery. That confirmation never came. His office occupied the entire 38th floor of Noble Tower in Boston's financial district, a column of glass and reinforced steel that cut the skyline with the quiet arrogance of something that had always intended to be there. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an uninterrupted view of the harbor, the water catching the late afternoon light like hammered silver. Leon stood with his back to all of it, jacket removed, sleeves rolled to the forearm, reading the clause for the 3rd time. The firstborn son of Richard Noble shall, upon reaching the age of no less than 35 years, enter into matrimony with the firstborn daughter of Walter Potter, provided both parties remain unmarried at the time of execution. Failure to comply shall result in the immediate dissolution of the Noble Potter joint holdings, currently estimated at a combined value of. He set the paper down. $47 billion. Buried in a partnership agreement signed 32 years ago, before Leon had been old enough to hold a pen. His father, charming, reckless, a man who shook hands on things he'd never intended to be held to, had apparently made a promise over a bottle of 18-year scotch and a shared vision of the future. Richard Noble had been dead for 7 years. The joint holdings, however, were very much alive. Leon pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and turned toward the window. Declan Marsh, his chief legal counsel, sat on the other side of the desk with the expression of a man who had already rehearsed every possible counterargument and quietly discarded each one. "There's no exit clause," Leon said. It wasn't a question. Not without triggering dissolution. Declan set his own copy of the document down with the careful movements of someone handling something combustible. Walter Potter's attorneys have been patient. They're not threatening. They're simply waiting. Leon was quiet for a long moment. The harbor below moved through its indifferent rhythm, a cargo vessel making its slow way toward open water. "Pull up everything on Chelsea, Potter," he said. Declan hesitated one beat too long. "I've seen the file," Leon said flatly. "Pull it up anyway." The image appeared on the wall screen across the room. A photograph that looked as though it had been taken at some professional event 2 or 3 years prior. Chelsea Potter stood slightly apart from a cluster of people, as though being photographed was something she merely tolerated rather than sought. She wore a dark blazer over a collared shirt, chosen for function rather than occasion. Her natural hair was pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had more pressing things to consider. Tortoiseshell glasses sat on a face that wasn't unpleasant, just unremarkable at first glance. The kind of face that didn't announce itself to a room. Leon studied the photograph for exactly 4 seconds. "Fine," he said. Declan blinked. "Fine. Draw up the preliminary agreement. I want the terms structured so the marriage satisfies the contractual obligation without ambiguity. Standard arrangement, shared residence, public appearances as required. Private lives remain separate." He picked up his phone, already moving toward the next item in his mental queue. "I'll meet her once before the ceremony. Briefly. Leon, this is a marriage. It's a contract." His voice wasn't cold. It was precise. The way a scalpel is precise. "One I intend to honor efficiently and close cleanly. Schedule the meeting. Across the city, in a brownstone apartment in Cambridge that smelled of old books and fresh coffee. Chelsea Potter sat at her kitchen table with the same document open in front of her. Her apartment was small by design. Bookshelves covered every available wall. A well-worn upright piano sat against the window overlooking a narrow street lined with oak trees, and a desk was buried under research papers, academic journals, and 3 coffee mugs in various stages of abandonment. It was a space that reflected a mind that lived mostly inward, a life arranged around thought rather than performance. She read the clause slowly, not because she struggled to understand it, but because she believed important things deserved to be read with care. Her father had called that morning. The conversation had been gentle and fractured, the way conversations are when someone is trying to apologize for something they cannot undo. Walter Potter was 69 years old, soft-spoken, and carrying a guilt that had apparently aged alongside him for 3 decades. He had explained everything: the partnership, the agreement, the friendship that had bound 2 business families. He had told her she wasn't obligated, that he would find another way. Chelsea had listened without interrupting. Then she had said, quietly, "Dad, I'll handle it." Now she sat alone with the document and a half-empty mug of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Outside, rain began its patient work against the window glass. A neighbor's cat moved along the fence below. The radiator offered its low, rhythmic knock. She thought about Leon Noble. She had looked him up, of course. The photographs showed a man constructed for authority, broad-shouldered, sharp-featured, the kind of dark eyes that appeared to be perpetually calculating something. Every image placed him in the context of power. Boardrooms, charity galas, magazine covers with headlines like "The Coldest Man in the Room" and "Noble, the executive who never blinks." A man who would read her contract the way he read all contracts. Something to be managed and filed. Chelsea picked up the document and folded it carefully along its original crease. She ran her thumb along the edge of the paper, a quiet, unhurried gesture. The way a person touches something before deciding what it means. The apartment held its stillness around her. She looked up at nothing in particular, and something moved behind her eyes. Not fear, not resignation. Something quieter and more certain than either. "That's fine," she said softly to the empty room. "I know exactly who I am." She set the contract down, reached for her cold coffee, and took a sip. Chapter 2. The Veil. The cathedral on Tremont Street had been standing for 140 years, and it carried that age in every stone. Outside, The city moved the way it always moved, indifferent, relentless, the morning's first commuters threading through traffic with the efficiency of people who had somewhere to be. But inside the cathedral, sound behaved differently. It gathered at the vaulted ceiling and came back down softened, as if the building itself were asking everyone to slow down. Light fell through the stained glass windows in long columns of red and gold that shifted almost imperceptibly as the morning progressed. Leon Noble stood at the altar with his hands loose at his sides. He had arrived 14 minutes early, not out of sentiment, but because he despised the theater of a late entrance. His suit was charcoal, made by a tailor in Milan who had been dressing him for 9 years and understood that Leon required clothing he didn't have to think about. His jaw was set. His eyes, that particular shade of steel gray that people in boardrooms had learned to read carefully, were fixed on the far end of the aisle with the focused calm of a man preparing for a meeting to begin. His best man, Aaron Whitfield, stood 2 feet to his right with the contained tension of someone who had attempted to have a real conversation about this moment and been redirected every time. "You look like you're signing a hostile takeover," Aaron murmured, barely moving his lips. "I'm focused." "That's what I said." Leon didn't respond. He heard the shift in the room before he saw anything, a subtle change in attention, the way energy moves when something is about to happen. The doors at the far end of the cathedral opened. The organ began. He watched the procession with the same expression he brought to everything. Measured, contained. His gaze tracked movement the way it tracked data, efficiently, without unnecessary investment. A bridesmaid. Another. The elaborate floral arrangements his coordinator had spent 6 weeks sourcing. All of it processed and filed under necessary formality. Then the doors opened wider. Chelsea appeared. She was on her father's arm, moving at the unhurried pace of someone who had decided precisely how she intended to do this. The dress was ivory, clean lines, no excess, the kind of gown that didn't demand attention but somehow commanded it. Her natural hair had been styled into an elegant updo, soft at the edges, with a simplicity that managed to look like both discipline and grace. The veil, French lace, his coordinator had mentioned at some point during the weeks of logistics, fell from the crown of her head to the middle of her back, obscuring her face entirely. Leon watched her walk toward him. He noted the posture. Straight, unhurried, not performing for the room. He noted the way her hand rested on her father's arm lightly, as though she didn't need the support, but offered him the gesture anyway. He noted that she didn't look around at the cathedral or the guests. She looked directly ahead. At him. Even through the veil, the directness of it was impossible to miss. She reached the altar. Walter Potter placed his daughter's hand in Leon's with the careful movements of a man doing something irreversible and knowing it. Leon accepted her hand with the same neutral efficiency he'd brought to the entire morning. Her fingers were cool. Steady. The ceremony proceeded. Leon said what was required in the voice he used for presentations. Clear, unhesitating, carrying precisely the weight the moment demanded and no more. Chelsea spoke her vows quietly, each word placed with intention, as though she had considered them rather than simply memorized them. He noted that. When the officiant reached the moment, "You may now lift the veil," Leon turned to face her fully for the first time. He raised both hands, located the edge of the lace, and lifted it with the brisk confidence of a man who had no reason to anticipate anything extraordinary. The veil rose, and Leon Noble stopped. Not paused, not hesitated. Stopped. The way a system stops when something it was never built to process enters the equation without warning. Chelsea's eyes opened slowly, as though she had been somewhere quiet and was choosing unhurriedly to return. They were dark, a deep amber brown that caught the cathedral's colored light and held it, warm and layered, and carrying something that shifted when it moved. Her lashes were heavy and dark, framing a gaze that was unmistakably, almost uncomfortably intelligent. Her mouth held the shape of something that wasn't quite a smile, more like the knowledge of one held just below the surface. She was, without qualifier or hesitation, extraordinary. Leon's hands remained suspended in the air beside her face because his body had received no instruction to move them. His mind, the instrument that had guided every decision of his adult life with cold precision, went entirely, unutterably quiet. He had looked at the photograph. He had filed it and moved on. He had categorized her and closed the folder. The folder, it turned out, had contained the wrong information entirely. The cathedral continued to exist around them, the officiant, the guests, the colored light moving slowly across the stone floor. But Leon stood in a pocket of stillness that felt entirely separate from all of it. His eyes were fixed on her face with an expression that had no available category. Chelsea looked at him. She let the moment be what it was, neither rushing it nor rescuing him from it. There was no triumph in her expression, no performance, just a calm, clear steadiness that made everything simultaneously worse and better. He couldn't determine which. Then, very quietly, she tilted her head a fraction of an inch. "Leon," she said, her voice low enough for only him. "You have a wedding to finish." His hands came down. He exhaled once, controlled, barely audible, and turned to face the officiant with his jaw set and his shoulders squared. Every outward surface restored to its usual architecture. But something behind his eyes had shifted, and it did not shift back. Chapter 3. The Penthouse. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building on Commonwealth Avenue that had been featured in 4 design publications and described in each of them as a study in controlled perfection. 14 rooms. Ceilings that reached nearly 4 meters. Floor-to-ceiling windows on every exterior wall offering an uninterrupted panorama of the Charles River to the north and the illuminated grid of Back Bay to the south. The kitchen alone was larger than Chelsea's entire Cambridge apartment. Everything was white, charcoal, or the particular shade of warm ash wood that expensive interior designers favored when they wanted to suggest warmth without quite committing to it. Leon had lived here for 5 years and never once found it small. He showed her the room at the east end of the corridor on the first night. Spacious. Its own bathroom. A window seat that overlooked the river. He had asked his household manager to stock it in advance with the same logistical efficiency he applied to preparing a guest suite for a visiting executive. "The kitchen is fully stocked," he said from the doorway, jacket already removed, his posture carrying the particular neutrality of someone who had decided in advance how this conversation would go. "My schedule begins at 6:30 most mornings. I'm generally back by 8 in the evening, sometimes later. You'll have the space to yourself through most of the day." Chelsea stood in the center of the room and looked around slowly. The high ceiling, the carefully chosen abstract art on the walls, the linen folded with geometric precision at the foot of the bed. "It's beautiful," she said simply. He waited for something else. A question, a complaint, a counterproposal. Nothing came. "Good." He cleared his throat. "If you need anything adjusted, speak to Mrs. Fairbanks. She manages the household." Chelsea turned and looked at him directly, the way she had at the altar. "Thank you, Leon." He left. The first 3 days built their own quiet architecture. A structure of parallel lives sharing the same square footage without collision. Leon left before Chelsea woke. Chelsea spent her days unpacking slowly, learning the geography of the kitchen, reading on the window seat with her legs folded beneath her. By the time Leon returned each evening, she had retired to her room. By the time she woke each morning, he was already gone. Efficient. Orderly. Exactly as agreed. On the 4th morning, the order broke. Leon came down the hallway at 6:15 to find the kitchen already occupied. Chelsea stood at the counter with her back to him, barefoot on the cold marble floor, a book open beside the coffee machine, her hair down. He had only ever seen her hair pinned back or arranged. Now it fell across her shoulders in dark, loose waves, and the domestic ease of the image, the bare feet, the open book, The unhurried posture of someone who existed in a space without apology stopped him for a fraction of a second at the kitchen entrance. Chelsea heard him. She didn't turn around immediately. "There's coffee," she said. Her voice had that particular morning quality. Unhurried, unlayered. Leon moved to the machine. He poured a cup. He stood at the opposite end of the counter with the practiced ease of someone establishing appropriate perimeter. She turned a page. He drank his coffee. The river was silver in the early light outside the north window. "What are you reading?" he asked. He had not planned to ask anything. She turned the book so he could see the spine. A dense academic text on linguistic anthropology. Not light reading, not a gesture toward anything accessible. "Are you a linguist?" "I study how language shapes social identity in diaspora communities," she said. She poured her own coffee and turned to lean against the counter with the book closed over one finger. Specifically, second-generation communities in Western Europe. She paused. "It's not glamorous. Most worthwhile things aren't." She looked at him. He had the impression she was cataloging something. He put down his cup. He picked up his phone. He left. But the exchange stayed with him through the morning with a persistence he found mildly irritating and couldn't entirely account for. 3 days later, he came home at 7:15 to find the apartment smelling of something warm. He moved through the hallway and found the kitchen counter occupied by a bowl covered with a small plate, and beside it, a note card in clean, unhurried handwriting. "I made too much." Second shelf. He opened the refrigerator. A container of homemade soup sat on the second shelf, labeled in the same handwriting. Leon stood at the counter for a moment. Then he put the soup in a pot, heated it, and ate standing at the window with the river below him going dark in the evening. It was the best thing he'd eaten in longer than he could immediately calculate. He did not mention it. Neither did she. But the next morning, he came down at 6:15 again. This time on purpose. Chapter 4. The Snow. The storm arrived the way serious things often arrive. Quietly at first, then all at once. By the time Leon woke on a Saturday in early February, the city had surrendered. Snow pressed against every window in long, white silence. The avenues below had vanished beneath it. The Charles River was invisible. Boston had become a study in erasure. He came down the hallway to find Chelsea already in the living room, cross-legged on the floor in front of the fireplace she had apparently located and figured out how to use, a blanket around her shoulders, and her laptop open in her lap. She had the particular quality of self-containment of someone who had always known how to be comfortable in her own company. "The city's shut down," she said without looking up. "I noticed." He moved to the kitchen and put on coffee. He stood at the counter and looked at his phone. 6 meetings, all canceled. A conference call with London, rescheduled. His day, which had been precisely structured, had become completely unstructured, which was not a condition Leon Noble experienced often and had never particularly sought. He brought 2 mugs to the living room and set one beside her without comment. She looked up from the screen. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "Thank you." He sat in the chair nearest the window. Not the couch. The chair that placed him 8 feet away with a clear sight line to his own thoughts. They worked in companionable silence for an hour. He at his laptop, she at hers, the fire doing its quiet work between them. The snow continued its indifferent accumulation outside. It was Chelsea who broke the silence. Not with anything weighted. She simply asked, without preamble, whether he had ever read anything that had genuinely changed how he thought about something. Not influenced. Changed. Leon considered the question with more seriousness than he would have predicted. He told her about a biography of a mathematician he had read at 22, a man who had spent his entire career trying to prove a theorem he never solved, and whose pursuit of the unsolvable had nevertheless produced some of the most significant mathematical tools of the 20th century. Leon had read it as a case study in efficient resource allocation and come away understanding something entirely different, that the value of effort was not always located in the outcome. Chelsea set her laptop aside. She was looking at him in a way that he was becoming familiar with. The way she looked at things she found interesting, openly, without the performance of casualness. "You read that and thought about resource allocation?" she asked. "Initially. What did you think about afterward?" He was quiet for a moment. "Whether the things I consider failures might be building something I can't see yet." She was quiet too. The fire popped once. The snow continued. Then she said, "I changed my entire doctoral thesis 6 months before my defense." He looked up. "I'd spent 3 years on a particular argument," she said. "And 6 months before the defense I read a single paper that showed me my central premise had a flaw I couldn't argue around. A logical gap I'd been talking myself out of noticing." She looked at the fire. "I rewrote the thesis. Filed for a 6-month extension. My supervisor thought I'd lost my mind." A brief pause. "I defended it the following spring. It became the basis for my first published paper." "Was it better?" Leon asked. "It was honest." She looked at him, which meant it was better. He held her gaze for a moment longer than he meant to. Midway through the afternoon, he heard it. He had gone to his study to respond to a series of emails that couldn't wait, and the sound arrived through the half-open door. Music, but not the recorded kind. Something played live from the living room. Fluid, searching, moving between something melancholy and something that kept almost arriving and then pulling back. He moved quietly to the archway between the hallway and the living room. Chelsea sat at the upright piano near the west window. Her back was straight, her eyes closed, and what came from beneath her hands was not careful practice, but something entirely her own. A composition without a name, searching for one. Leon stood in the archway and did not announce himself. He told himself it was because he didn't want to interrupt. He stayed for 7 minutes. When she reached a natural pause, she opened her eyes and looked at the window without turning. "You've been standing there for a while. I didn't want to stop you." She turned on the bench. Unhurried. "You could have just come in." "I know." He crossed the room and sat in the armchair nearest the piano. Not across the room. 4 feet away. Close enough that retreating would have felt dishonest. "What was that?" "Something I've been working on. It doesn't have a name yet." She looked at the keys. "I play better when I think no one can hear." "Why?" She considered the question with the seriousness she brought to questions that deserved it. "Because when someone's listening, you start performing. And performance and honesty don't always live in the same place." Leon was quiet. Outside, the snow continued its indifferent work. "Play something else," he said. She looked at him. That direct, level look, checking something she didn't name. Then she turned back to the keys and played. By the time the fire had burned low and the storm had pressed the city into full dark, they were sitting on the floor with their backs against the couch. A bottle of wine on the coffee table, and the remnants of a dinner Chelsea had assembled from whatever the refrigerator offered spread between them. The conversation had been moving for 2 hours, through territory that Leon hadn't mapped, hadn't expected to navigate, hadn't planned to find interesting. At some point the wine ran low and Alice pulled her knees to her chest and said, with the quiet directness of someone who had been thinking about something for longer than the evening, "Do you ever get tired of being the person everyone expects you to be?" Leon looked at the fire. The question sat between them with its full weight, not aggressive, not manipulative, just honest in the way certain questions are honest. The kind that know exactly where the door is. He turned his head and looked at her in the firelight. Her eyes were warm and deep, watching him with a patience that required nothing from him, that would wait as long as necessary and ask nothing if nothing came. His mouth opened. He closed it, opened it again. "Yes," he said, just that one word, carrying more than he had handed to another person and longer than he could calculate. Chelsea held his gaze and nodded once, slowly, not with pity, not with victory, with something that felt, with an intimacy that alarmed him completely, like recognition. The fire crackled. The storm held the city. Thomas sat with the unsettling, undeniable understanding that he was in territory for which no map existed. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. 3 weeks had passed since the storm. 3 weeks of a penthouse that had quietly, without announcement, reorganized itself around 2 people instead of 1. Coffee made in quantities that assumed company. Books migrating from Chelsea's room to the living room table and back. The piano played in the evenings without apology now, and Leon had stopped pretending he wasn't listening from his study with the door left 2 inches open. The arrangement had shifted. Neither of them had named it. It was Chelsea who finally pulled the thread. She came into the living room on a Tuesday evening in March, the original contract in her hand. Not as a weapon, not with aggression, just with the calm purposefulness of someone who had decided that a specific conversation needed to happen and had chosen tonight to have it. Leon was at his desk near the north window. Jacket off. The city glowing 38 floors below in the particular way it glowed on cold, clear nights. All geometry and light. She set the document on the desk between them. He looked at it, then at her. "I need to understand something," she said. Her voice was steady, but carried an edge, not anger, more like precision. The tone of someone who had organized their thoughts and intended to use them. "What is this for you right now? What are we actually doing?" Leon leaned back in his chair. "We're honoring an agreement." "Are we?" She didn't move. "Because an agreement is what this was 3 months ago. I'm not sure that's the accurate word for what it is now." Something tightened in his jaw. "Leon." Her voice was level and unflinching. "The night of the snowstorm. The conversations at 11 o'clock that have nothing to do with contracts or appearances." Her eyes held his without moving. "I'm not asking you to define it. I'm asking you to be honest about it. To me. Or at least to yourself." Leon stood. The motion wasn't aggressive. It was the movement of someone who needed a different relationship with the space, who thought better on their feet when a conversation required it. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, looking at the city with his hands clasped behind him. "You're asking me to characterize something I don't have language for," he said. "Then find language for it. It's not that simple." "I know it isn't." Her voice softened without losing its steadiness. "I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking for true." He turned. She was closer than he had registered. The desk was no longer between them. Just the air of the room, the yellow light from the city below, and the unresolved weight of everything the last 3 months had quietly accumulated. Her eyes were direct and serious and entirely without pretense. Her hair was down. She was wearing a dark wrap dress, and her arms were crossed loosely at her waist in a way that wasn't defensive, just contained, as though she was holding herself carefully while she waited for him. "I signed the contract," Leon said. His voice was lower now, stripped of its boardroom precision. "Because it was a legal obligation. Because walking away would have cost more than I was willing to lose." A pause. The muscle in his jaw moved. "That's why I signed it." "I know," she said. "What I didn't," he stopped. Started again. "What I did not account for was you." The room held very still. "I don't know what to do with you, Chelsea." The admission came out with the rough honesty of something that had been compressed for too long. "I know how to run companies. I know how to read a room and close a deal and manage every variable in a situation. I have never once in my adult life encountered something I couldn't eventually reduce to something manageable." His eyes stayed on hers, dark and unguarded, in a way she had only seen in firelight before this moment. "And then there's you." Something moved in her expression. Not triumph. Nothing like that. Something warmer and more complicated. Something that looked like it might hurt a little. "Leon, I'm not finished." He said it quietly, almost gently. He took one step toward her, then another. The distance between them became something measurable in inches rather than feet. The air in that reduced space had a different quality, charged and still, simultaneously, the way the atmosphere changes before something significant. His hand came up. It moved slowly, with none of his usual decisive efficiency, as though some part of him was making this choice in real time. His fingers touched her face, just the edge of her jaw, the lightest possible contact, but contact that had nothing contractual about it, and both of them knew it. Chelsea didn't move. Her eyes stayed on his, steady and open and waiting. He kissed her. It began in the territory of something compressed, all the weeks and unspoken admissions finding their sudden exit, and then within seconds became something else entirely. Something slower and more honest than anything that had happened in this apartment. His hand moved from her jaw to the back of her head. Her arms uncrossed, and her hands found the fabric of his shirt. The city continued its indifferent illumination 38 floors below, while the two of them stood in the living room and confessed everything they hadn't been able to say out loud. When it ended, they stayed close. Neither spoke for a long moment. Leon was the first to step back. His hand fell from her hair. His voice, when it came, was quieter than she had ever heard it. Rougher, stripped of all its usual architecture. "That wasn't in the contract," he said. Chelsea stood with her fingertips still resting at the edge of his shirt. Her heart was doing something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Loud, present, entirely honest. She looked at him in the city-lit dark, this man who had walked into her life through a legal document and somehow become the most disorienting thing in it. "No," she said softly. "It wasn't." He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he turned and walked to his room. The door closed behind him with a quietness that felt louder than a slam. Chelsea stood where he had left her. She pressed her open hand slowly against her chest, feeling her own heartbeat against her palm. Insistent, undeniable, very much alive. The contract was still on the desk. Neither of them had touched it. Chapter 6. Distance. The Monday after the kiss, Leon flew to Chicago. He didn't mention it the night before. Chelsea found out the way she found out most things about his schedule, through the household calendar his assistant kept updated on the shared apartment system. A small notification appearing on her phone at 6:50 in the morning. L. Noble. ORD departure 6:15 a.m. return. TBD. TBD. The abbreviation sat in her chest with a specific weight. She made her coffee. She stood at the north window and watched the Charles River below slowly catch the morning light. Joggers beginning their circuits along the path, the first boats cutting through the water. All of it moving through a world that had no idea what had happened in this apartment 4 nights ago. She drank her coffee to the end. She rinsed the mug, set it on the drying rack with the quiet precision of someone organizing their thoughts through their hands, and went about her day. She did not allow herself to be surprised. She had seen the walls from the beginning. Their architecture was unmistakable to anyone who had ever built a few of their own. Leon stayed in Chicago for 4 days. His suite at the Drake Hotel had a view of Lake Michigan that on any other occasion he would have found adequate. He had 3 acquisition meetings, 2 working dinners, and 1 conference call that ran until midnight with a legal team in Frankfurt. His days were structured and purposeful, and left almost no unscheduled space, which was precisely what he required. He called Declan from the back of a car on the second evening, moving through the illuminated grid of Michigan Avenue, ostensibly to discuss the terms of a pending deal. They discussed those terms for 9 minutes. Then Declan said, with the careful neutrality of a man who had known Leon for 13 years, "How's the apartment?" "I'm in Chicago." "I know you're in Chicago, Leon." A pause. The city moved past the window in streaks of light. "The deal terms are fine," Leon said. "Send me the revised draft tonight." He ended the call and looked at his phone for a moment before putting it in his pocket. The car moved through the city. The lake sat dark and enormous to the east, indifferent and vast. He did not call the apartment, but the apartment, quietly and without asking permission, followed him. It arrived in small, specific ways he had no efficient system for managing. The particular quality of the hotel suite's silence, complete, anonymous, the silence of a space that contained nothing of anyone. The absence of piano music at the hour when he had grown accustomed without realizing it to hearing it. The moment on the 3rd morning when he reached for his coffee and looked up from his laptop with the instinct of someone expecting to find another person in the room. The room was empty. He looked at it for 3 seconds, then back at his screen. On the fourth day, he flew to Denver. Back in Boston, Chelsea inhabited the penthouse with the quiet self-possession of someone who had decided consciously not to shrink. She worked from the living room in the mornings. She played the piano in the evenings. On Wednesday, she had dinner with her closest friend, Renee, a small French bistro in Back Bay where the tables were too close together and the wine list was always right. Renee had known Chelsea for 11 years. She had the particular skill of people who have loved someone long enough to see past what they're saying to what they mean. She waited until the second glass of wine, then said without preamble, "You're in love with him." Chelsea set down her fork. "That's not a question." "No, it isn't." Chelsea looked up. Her eyes were steady, but there was something behind them that Renee recognized immediately. The expression of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has just been given permission to acknowledge the weight. "It doesn't matter what I feel," Chelsea said quietly. "If he's going to spend the rest of his life running from it. Maybe he needs time. Maybe." Chelsea picked up her wine. "Or maybe he spent 40 years building something impenetrable and 4 days in Chicago was just maintenance work." Renee was quiet for a moment. "And if it's just maintenance, what then?" Chelsea looked at the candle on the table between them, its small flame entirely steady in the still air of the room. She thought about a man standing in a kitchen doorway at 6 in the morning, staying 3 seconds longer than he needed to. A hand finding the small of her back with no instruction from logic. A voice at its lowest register saying, "I did not account for you." The way a man speaks when an admission is extracted under considerable pressure. "Then I wait," she said quietly. "Because I've spent a lot of my life being invisible to people who didn't look carefully enough." A pause. "He looks carefully. He just doesn't know what to do with what he sees yet." Leon returned from Denver on a Friday evening. He came through the apartment door at 9:20 to find the living room lit warmly, the remnants of Chelsea's dinner cleared, the piano bench empty. From somewhere down the hall came the faint sound of a documentary she had mentioned wanting to watch. Something about marine geography. He set his bag down. He stood in the hallway for a moment, absorbing the particular quality of an apartment that had a person in it. The warmth. The subtle evidence of inhabitation. The sense that the space had been lived in during his absence rather than simply waded through. On the kitchen counter, he found a small yellow note in her handwriting. Neat. Unhurried. The letters formed with the same attention she brought to everything. "There's soup in the refrigerator. Second shelf. See." That was all. No performance. No statement. No pressure. Just soup on the second shelf, and the initial she used the way people sign things when they've stopped needing to explain themselves. Leon stood at the counter with the note in his hand for a length of time that would have been difficult to justify to anyone who asked. Then he went to the refrigerator, found the soup on the second shelf exactly where she said, and heated it in silence. It was the first thing he'd eaten in 4 days that felt like it had been made for him specifically. He put the note down carefully on the counter rather than throwing it away. He did not examine why. Chapter 7. 3 in the morning. The city at 3 in the morning had its own particular character. Not silent. Boston was never truly silent, but reduced. Stripped of its daytime insistence. Running on a quieter frequency. The avenues below the penthouse carried the occasional sweep of headlights, a distant siren curving somewhere through the grid and fading. The low, persistent murmur of a city that never fully surrendered to the dark. From 38 floors up, it looked almost peaceful, almost like something that could be understood. Chelsea was awake. She had been awake since 1:30, which was not unusual for her during periods when her mind refused the courtesy of stopping. She sat in the window seat of her room with her knees drawn up and a book open in her lap that she had been reading the same paragraph of for 20 minutes. The lamp beside her was on its lowest setting. Outside, the park was a dark, irregular shape pressed between the geometry of buildings, and the sky above downtown held that particular urban glow, not quite amber, not quite gray, the color of a city dreaming. She had been thinking about the note she'd left on the counter. Not with regret. She didn't regret it. But with the quiet awareness of someone who has made a small, honest gesture and is now sitting with the vulnerability of having made it. The soup had been gone when she came down the following morning. The note had been folded once and left on the counter rather than thrown away, which she had noticed and chosen not to interpret too carefully. Leon had been different since his return. Not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man, but different in the way a room is different when a window has been opened somewhere. Same room, same furniture, same light. But something moving through it that hadn't been there before. He had stayed for coffee 2 mornings running. He had asked about her research with the focused attention he brought to things that actually interested him. And the conversation had run 40 minutes past the point where either of them had noticed the time. He was finding his way toward something. She could see it clearly. She turned a page she hadn't read. The knock came at 3:12. 3 sounds, slightly spaced. Not urgent. Not loud. The knock of someone who had been standing outside the door for a while before deciding to use their hand on it. Chelsea recognized it immediately for what it was. The sound of a man who did not do uncertain things arriving at an uncertain moment. She set the book aside and crossed the room. She opened the door. Leon stood in the hallway in a gray Henley with the sleeves pushed to his forearms and dark track pants. Not dressed for company, dressed for insomnia. His jacket was gone. His hair was slightly undone from its daytime architecture. He had been awake too, she could see. Not restless in the ordinary way, but awake in the way people are when something internal refuses to quiet. His eyes found hers and stayed there. He looked, for the first and only time since she had known him, uncertain. Not lost. Leon Noble was too fundamentally oriented to be lost, but uncertain. Standing at the threshold of her room with the city glowing behind him through the hallway window. Wearing his vulnerability the way someone wears something they've never worn before. Aware of it. Not entirely sure it fits. Unable to take it off. Chelsea leaned against the doorframe and said nothing. She gave him the space the moment required. He looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and unvarnished. The voice she had heard only in firelight, and in the immediate aftermath of the kiss. The voice that existed underneath all the architecture of Leon Noble, billionaire and executive. The voice that was simply him. "I can't sleep when you're nearby," he said. The words came carefully, like he was setting them down rather than throwing them. "Because I'm aware of you." Every room he stopped. Reorganized. "I know when you're in the kitchen before I see you. I know when you've been in my study because the air is different." Another stop. His jaw tightened briefly, then released. "I flew to Chicago and then to Denver because I needed distance, and it didn't work. You were still." A pause. "You were just there?" "Wherever I was." Chelsea held his gaze. Her heart was doing the thing it had been doing since the night in the living room. That steady, honest insistence that was impossible to argue with. "And when you're not near," he continued, quieter still, "I can't sleep either. Because the apartment is wrong. The silence is the wrong kind." He looked at her with the dark eyes that had, in the months since a cathedral on Tremont Street, become the most readable thing she had ever encountered. "I don't know what to do with that." The hallway held its 3 a.m. quiet around them. The city's low murmur 38 floors below. The faint presence of a life shared in the same space for months. The accumulated weight of everything said and unsaid since a contract had brought 2 strangers to the same roof. Chelsea looked at him. At the open collar. At the man who ran corporations and could not sleep and had knocked on her door at 3 a.m. because the alternative was worse. She felt something settle in her chest. Not resolution exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt like arriving. She pushed off the doorframe and stepped to one side. Not toward him. Sideways. Clearing the threshold. Opening the room without demanding anything about what that meant. "Then stop trying," she said. Her voice was soft and entirely even, and carried no conditions. Leon looked at the open doorway, then at her face. He read it the way he read everything important. carefully, completely, looking for the thing beneath the surface. What he found there was the same thing he had been finding since the cathedral. Something steady and unperformed and entirely real. Offered without ultimatum, without theater, without the need for him to be anything other than what he was at 3 in the morning in a hallway. He stepped inside. The door closed behind him with the quietest sound in the world. Not a click so much as a settling. The sound of something finding the place it had been moving toward for a very long time. Outside, the city continued its low, illuminated dreaming. A light rain had begun at some point, barely audible against the windows, the kind of rain that arrives without announcement and stays without apology. Inside, the lamp in Chelsea's room was still on its lowest setting, casting its small warm light against the walls. And the apartment on the 38th floor was, for the first time since two strangers had agreed to share it, entirely and completely at rest. I'd love to know where in the world you are watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how global this love really is. Please take a few seconds to like the video and drop a comment, and if you're not a part of the family yet, please subscribe to encourage us and help the channel grow. Chapter 8. The morning after. The morning arrived without asking permission. Light came through the floor-to-ceiling windows and long, unhurried columns, the particular quality of early Boston light in spring, when the city briefly remembers that it is capable of softness. It moved across the room slowly, the way light moves when no one has closed the curtains and the world outside has decided to be generous. Leon was awake before it fully arrived. He had been awake for some time, actually, not anxiously, not with the restless alertness of his usual early mornings when his mind immediately reached for the day's agenda and began its relentless inventory. This was different. He was awake in the way someone is awake when they are somewhere entirely new, and the newness is not threatening but worth staying still inside of, worth not rushing past with habitual efficiency. Chelsea was asleep beside him. She lay with her face turned slightly away, one hand open near her cheek in the uncomplicated way of someone who sleeps without armor. Fully present, fully at rest, breathing with the quiet rhythm of a person whose conscience offers no resistance to sleep. Her hair spread across the pillow in dark waves. The morning light found her the way it found everything in this room, without preference or agenda. And what it illuminated was someone who looked, in this unguarded moment, exactly like herself. Leon looked at her for a long time without moving. His arm was across her shoulder. He was conscious of its weight, of the warmth where their proximity created its own specific temperature, of the fact that he had been awake for 40 minutes and had not moved because moving would change something. And he was, for the first time in his adult life, in no hurry to change anything. He thought about Chicago, about the anonymous silence of the hotel suite, about standing at the kitchen counter with a small yellow note in his hand and understanding, with the clarity of something long resisted finally landing, that what he had been managing with distance and discipline and carefully scheduled work had never been a problem to be solved. It had been a person to be reckoned with. He had spent 40 years being the most capable man in any room. He had never once considered that capability might be entirely useless in the face of the right person. Chelsea's eyes opened. She didn't startle. She came to wakefulness the way she did most things, gradually, with her own timing, on terms she set herself. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then turned her head and found him looking at her. Neither spoke immediately. The morning light continued its patient work across the room. The city began its first quiet stirrings 38 floors below. The two of them existed in the particular silence of people who have arrived somewhere significant and are taking a moment to acknowledge the distance traveled. "You're staring," she said. Her voice was soft with sleep, unhurried. "I'm looking," he said. "There's a difference." The corner of her mouth moved. "Is there?" Staring implies vacancy. A pause. "I'm paying attention." She looked at him with those amber-brown eyes that had been, since a cathedral on Tremont Street, the most honest mirror he had encountered. Something in them was warm and awake and quietly pleased. Not triumphant, not relieved, just genuinely present in a way that made the morning feel like something worth inhabiting. "You're the most disorienting person I've ever met," he said. The words came out with the directness of something that had been true for months and had finally found permission to be spoken plainly. "In my entire life, across every context, I have never once encountered someone I couldn't eventually categorize, understand well enough to predict." He held her gaze. "You don't behave like a category." Chelsea was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird, improbably 38 floors up, moved past the window in a brief arc of wings and was gone. "Maybe you've been using the wrong filing system," she said. He looked at her. And then, quietly, unexpectedly, he laughed. A real one. Short and unguarded, the kind that arrives before the internal editor can intercept it. Chelsea watched it happen with an expression that suggested she understood exactly how rare it was and intended to remember it. But the morning, generous as it was, carried something heavier underneath. Leon was in the kitchen when his phone rang. Not his assistant. Not Declan. A number he recognized immediately and had been, on some level, expecting. He looked at the screen for one moment. Then he answered. Walter Potter's voice was measured and careful. The voice of a man who had spent a lifetime choosing words with the precision of someone who understood their weight. "I hear things," Walter said. Not accusatory. Almost gentle. People talk. People who were at the anniversary gala talk. A pause. "Leon, I need to ask you directly. What is this between you and my daughter?" Leon stood at the kitchen window with the city spread below him in the full morning light. The river. The avenues. The impossible vertical geometry of a skyline that had no patience for ambiguity. "It's real," Leon said. The silence on the other end lasted long enough to mean something. "I believe you mean that," Walter said finally. "But meaning something and sustaining something are two different disciplines. You've spent your entire career treating assets as variables, acquiring, optimizing, moving on when the return diminishes." His voice was not unkind. It carried the weight of a father who had spent 30 years protecting something he could not bear to see damaged. Chelsea is not an asset. She is not a variable. She has spent her whole life being underestimated and quietly surviving it. "I cannot." His voice thickened slightly, then recovered. "I cannot watch her survive you." Leon said nothing for a long moment. He thought about a woman reading at 6 in the morning on a cold kitchen counter. A woman who played piano in the dark because honesty and performance didn't share the same address. A woman who left soup on the second shelf without asking for anything in return. Who stepped sideways in a doorway at 3 in the morning and said, then stopped trying, with no conditions attached to the offer. "Mr. Potter," Leon said. His voice was quiet and without performance. The 3 in the morning voice, the only one that was simply and entirely true. "I have built every significant thing in my life by never admitting to anyone that I was afraid of losing it. Because I believed that fear was a liability." He paused. "I'm telling you now that I'm afraid of losing her. I recognize that as the opposite of a liability." Another pause. "I'm telling you because you asked for honesty. And because she deserves someone who can say it out loud." The silence on Walter Potter's end had a different quality now. When he spoke again, his voice was slower, carrying something that had shifted. "Then show her," Walter said simply. "Not me. Her." The call ended. Leon set his phone on the counter and stood in the kitchen with the morning light on his hands and the weight of everything he had just said settling into the specific, unfamiliar shape of something he actually meant. From down the hall came the quiet sound of the shower running. Chelsea, beginning her morning with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had no idea that a conversation had just taken place that would require him to become, in at least one significant way, a different man than he had been yesterday. He thought about what that meant. He thought about what it would cost. The answer arrived without deliberation, which told him everything. Chapter 9, The Gala. The invitation had been on the calendar for 6 weeks. The Hartwell Foundation's annual spring reception, the kind of event where an attendance list read like a financial newspaper's masthead, and the subtext of every conversation was at least as important as the text. Leon attended every year. It was, in the language of his professional life, a necessary performance. This year was different in one specific way. This year, Chelsea would be there. She came out of the bedroom at 7:15 in a deep emerald gown, floor-length, structured at the shoulder, with a subtle architectural quality that managed to be both elegant and entirely understated. No excess, no apology. Her natural hair was styled up with a precision that somehow still looked soft, and small gold earrings caught the light in the hallway. Leon stood at the end of the corridor and looked at her for one full second before his expression arranged itself back into composure. She walked toward him with the unhurried directness that was simply how she moved through spaces. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," he said. He was not entirely sure that was accurate. The car ride to the venue was quiet in the easy way things had become quiet between them. Not empty, not tense, but the silence of two people who had stopped needing to fill space with performance. Chelsea looked out at the city moving past. Leon looked at her profile, and looked away, and looked again. The venue was a renovated warehouse in the seaport, the kind of industrial-turned-elegant space that architects loved and Leon generally ignored the aesthetics of. Tonight he noticed the way the warm light fell across the brick walls, the reflection of it in Chelsea's earrings, the particular way the room recalibrated when she walked into it, not with the loud recalibration of someone who demanded attention, but the quiet kind. The kind where people turned without quite knowing why, and then found they were watching. He watched them watch her. Something moved in his chest that he categorized, with precision, as pride. And then, one beat later, as something else. Something closer to recognition. Something that said, "This is mine to protect." He had never felt that about a person before. The first 2 hours proceeded with the choreography that these events required. Leon worked the room with the efficiency of a man who had been doing it for 15 years. The conversations, the handshakes, the calibrated exchanges that maintained relationships essential to the operation of his business. He introduced Chelsea without performance, without over-explanation, simply as his wife. He watched the way she navigated the room beside him, not performing ease, but genuinely at ease. She spoke to the Foundation's director of research for 20 minutes with the focused attention of someone who had found something interesting. She listened to a retired senator recount a story about a policy battle from the 90s with an authentic engagement that made the man's face change, a subtle brightening that happened when someone was being genuinely heard. At some point in the third hour, a man Leon knew, a hedge fund manager named Brett Sanderson, who operated with the specific carelessness of someone who had never been held accountable for anything, found Chelsea at the edge of the terrace with a drink and a smile that Leon recognized immediately as the smile of a man making a calculation. Leon was across the room. He watched. Chelsea handled it with the particular composure of a woman who had been navigating this specific category of male behavior for her entire adult life. She was not rude. She was not flattered. She was simply and entirely herself, direct, warm, and utterly uninterested, in a way that communicated its message without drama. Sanderson retreated within 90 seconds. Leon crossed the room. "You had that handled," he said, arriving at her side with his glass. "I've had it handled since I was 23, she said. She glanced at him with an expression that held something dry and amused. "You were watching. I was nearby. You were watching." He looked at her sideways. "Yes." She turned to face the terrace view, the harbor, the lights, the darkness beyond. She was quiet for a moment. "This is your world," she said. "Not as an accusation, just as an observation." "It's where I operate," he said. "It's not my world." She turned and looked at him. The distinction mattered to her. He could see it. The distinction between inhabiting a space and belonging to it. "What is?" she asked. He thought about a kitchen in the early morning, a fireplace during a storm, a piano playing in the dark, a hallway at 3 in the morning. "Getting narrower," he said, "and more specific." She looked at him for a long moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved in the way it moved when something had landed somewhere she hadn't quite expected. They stayed on the terrace for 40 minutes after that, talking in a way that had nothing to do with the event around them. And when they finally left, Leon placed his hand at the small of her back as they moved through the crowd. Not a gesture of possession, not performance. The instinctive placement of someone who had discovered, somewhere in the last several months, that there was a person he wanted to be close to. In the car home, Chelsea was quiet. The city moved past outside. At some point she reached across the seat and found his hand, and he turned his palm over and held hers. They didn't speak until they were home, but neither of them let go. Chapter 10. The Terms. It was Declan who raised it. Leon had half expected it and had, with professional discipline, simply not thought about it until the moment arrived. They were in Leon's office on a Tuesday morning in late April, the harbor below catching the spring light in long white flashes, when Declan set a folder on the desk with the careful movements of a man who had been organizing his approach to this conversation since the car ride over. "The initial contract period," Declan said. "The 1-year mark is in 6 weeks." Leon looked at the folder without opening it. "The dissolution clause no longer applies. Obviously, the marriage is valid and legally sound. But the original agreement included a review provision." Declan paused. "Technically, both parties have the option to renegotiate terms at the 1-year mark. I need to know how you'd like to proceed." Leon was quiet for a long moment. The harbor moved below him in its patient, silver way. "What would renegotiating terms involve?" he said. "In practical terms, it could mean anything from adjusting financial arrangements to formalizing dissolution if both parties agree." Declan's voice remained carefully neutral. "Or it could mean nothing, letting the current arrangement continue unchanged." Leon turned from the window. "Draw up a new agreement," he said. Declan opened his pen. "Full and permanent," Leon said. "No review provisions. No dissolution clauses. No exit architecture of any kind." He looked at Declan directly. "I want it to be a marriage, not a contract that resembles one." Declan looked at him for one beat. "I'll need Chelsea's signature as well." "I know, Leon." Declan set down his pen, which was something he almost never did in the middle of a professional exchange. "Is she aware of that?" "Not yet." Leon held his counsel's gaze. "I intend to tell her myself. Tonight." He came home at 7, which was early for him by recent standards. The apartment smelled of something warm. Chelsea cooking, which she did with the same quality of focused, pleasurable attention she brought to everything. He found her in the kitchen, barefoot, in a loose cream-colored dress, standing at the stove with a cookbook open on the counter and a glass of white wine beside it. She looked up when he came in. "You're early." "I know." He set his bag down and moved to the counter. She handed him the open wine bottle without being asked, the kind of small, practiced fluency that accumulated quietly in a shared life until it became the texture of the life itself. He poured a glass. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. She turned the stove to low and turned to face him, leaning against the counter with her arms loosely crossed. The expression she wore was the one he knew best now, open and attentive, present without pressure. He told her about the meeting with Declan, about the 1-year review provision, about what it offered and what he intended to do with it. He told her, without architecture or construction, that he wanted to remove every exit from the document, that he wanted what they had built, quietly, accidentally, entirely outside the terms of any agreement, to be the thing that was formalized, not the arrangement, not the contract, the actual thing. He told her that he understood she had her own mind about it, and that whatever she decided, he would accept without negotiation. Chelsea was quiet while he spoke. She listened with the quality of attention that was, he had come to understand, one of the most extraordinary things about her. Not passive, not simply polite, but genuinely and completely present. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You want to take out the exit clause," she said. "Every one of them." "Because?" He looked at her directly. "Because I don't need one." She held his gaze. Something moved behind her eyes, not surprise exactly, but a kind of deep, internal settling. The expression of someone receiving confirmation of something they have believed quietly for a long time. "I'll sign it," she said. "Chelsea." "I'll sign it," she said again, simply. "But I want one condition." He waited. "No more Chicago," she said. "No more Denver. When something is difficult, we stay and we talk about it." She held his gaze with the particular steadiness that had been since a cathedral in the fall, the most reliable thing in his life. "That's the only term I want to add." Leon looked at her. This woman who had sat at a kitchen table with a legal document and a cold cup of coffee, told an empty room she knew exactly who she was, and had been right, completely and without revision, ever since. "Agreed," he said. She picked up her wine glass. He picked up his. They touched the rims together, quietly, in the kitchen with the Boston evening outside and the stove on low behind them. Not a ceremony. Not a performance. Just two people confirming something that had already, somewhere between a cathedral and a snowstorm and a hallway at 3 in the morning, become entirely true. Chapter 11. What was hidden? The industry profile appeared on a Thursday morning. Not a hostile piece. There was nothing overtly hostile about it. It was the kind of profile that ran in financial publications with long readerships and longer memories, the kind that assembled its conclusions from public record, corporate filings, and background quotes attributed to sources close to the subject. The kind that presented itself as neutral and was not, quite. The headline read, "Noble's Personal Year. How Marriage Has Changed the Calculus of Boston's Most Guarded Executive." Chelsea found it the same way she found most things she didn't go looking for, her phone, over coffee, a Thursday morning. She read it through once. Then again. The piece was not unkind to her. It was, in some respects, almost admiring, describing her academic work with surprising accuracy, noting her publication record, her institutional affiliations. It positioned her, in the language of the piece, as a surprising but credible match. A woman of genuine accomplishment. But beneath the admiration ran a quieter current. Sources familiar with Noble's operating style, the piece noted, suggest the marriage was initially understood as a contractual convenience, a legacy agreement honoring a decades-old partnership. The question now being asked in certain circles, has Leon Noble developed a genuine personal attachment, or is this simply the next phase of a long-term asset management strategy? Chelsea set her phone down on the kitchen table. She sat with it for a moment. The coffee steamed. The morning held its usual stillness. She thought about the profile's central question. She turned it over the way she turned over ideas that needed to be looked at from more than one angle. She was not angry. She was not hurt. She was, and she examined this carefully, simply aware. Aware that this was a version of the question that would follow them for as long as they were a visible pair. Aware that the world outside this apartment had its own narrative about them, and that narrative was built on incomplete information and would always be. She thought about what she knew, what she had seen. She had seen a man at 3 in the morning who did not know how to be vulnerable and did it anyway. She had seen a man eat soup in silence at a kitchen window and keep a small note rather than throw it away. She had seen a man on a call with her father say, "I'm afraid of losing her," without performance, without strategy, in the voice that cost him something to use. She had seen enough. She picked up her phone and called Leon. He answered on the second ring. She could hear the particular texture of his office background, the contained hum of a building in full operation. "Have you seen the profile?" she said. A pause. "Yes." "Are you bothered by it?" Another pause, this one carrying something different. "I'm bothered by the question it implies," he said carefully. "Which question?" "Whether what I feel for you is another form of management." The directness of the answer, unrehearsed and immediate, landed somewhere specific in her chest. "Is it?" she said, not as an accusation, as a genuine question. "No." His voice was quiet, and without any architecture around it at all. "It is the first thing in 40 years that I have been entirely incapable of managing, which is not a comfortable experience for a man built the way I was built." A pause. "But it is also the truest thing I know." Chelsea looked out the kitchen window at the bright spring day. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Okay, I believe you." A pause. "Come home for dinner. I'll cook." She could hear something in his silence. The particular quality of a man recalibrating downward, away from the defensive architecture he had lived in for decades, into something simpler and more honest. "I'll be there at 7, he said. He was there at 6:40. That evening, after dinner, they sat on the floor in front of the fireplace the way they had during the snowstorm. Naturally, without deciding to, the migration happening in the easy, unremarkable way of things that had become habitual. The fire was lower this time, the evening warmer. Chelsea had her knees up and a glass of wine balanced on top of them. Leon was beside her, his shoulder against hers. "I have a question," she said. "Ask it. What was your father actually like? Not the version that appears in the corporate history." Leon was quiet for a long moment. The fire worked at its small patient project. "He was charming," Leon said finally. "Genuinely charming. In the way that makes people follow you into rooms they shouldn't enter." A pause. "He was also reckless in specific ways that cost other people more than they cost him. The contract on our desk is a perfect example." He looked at the fire. He believed the world would accommodate his impulses. Mostly it did. A pause. "He loved me. In ways that didn't always look like love from the outside. But they were, underneath the difficulty, entirely genuine." Chelsea was quiet for a moment. "You're not like him," she said. Not as a reassurance. As an observation. "I'm like him in the ways I worked hardest not to be," Leon said. "Which might be the most honest thing I've ever said about it." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, and his profile in the firelight was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. The jaw unclenched, the eyes carrying something that was simply him, simply human, simply the weight of having been someone's complicated child. She reached over and placed her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. The fire continued its quiet work. Chapter 12, Carmel. Leon told her they were taking a trip. He did not ask. He did not suggest. He said it on a Sunday evening with the particular purposefulness of a man who had made a decision and was executing it, which was, she had come to understand, his primary love language. "Where?" she asked. "California." She waited for the itinerary. The hotel name. The structured schedule. None came. "That's all I'm getting," she said. "We leave Wednesday." She looked at him. Something in his expression, an ease, a quiet intention, told her the vagueness was not oversight. It was deliberate. "Okay," she said. They flew to San Francisco on Wednesday morning. At the airport, instead of meeting a car and driver, Leon walked to the rental desk and collected keys with the easy purposefulness of a man who had decided, for once, to drive. Chelsea noted this. She said nothing. They took Highway 1 south from the city. The Pacific appeared to their left without warning. An expanse so enormous and so indifferently beautiful that Chelsea went quiet for a full minute, just looking at it. The coastal highway curved through headlands and cypress trees, the ocean flashing silver through gaps in the vegetation, the air coming through the windows smelling of salt and something living. "Where specifically?" she asked eventually. "Carmel," he said. He kept his eyes on the road. "Why Carmel?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the directness of someone who had been thinking about how to say something for a while and had decided to simply say it. "Because there are no board members there. No cameras. No one who knows either of us or has an opinion about what we are to each other." A pause. "And because I've been meaning to take you somewhere with nothing obligatory about it. For a while now." Chelsea looked at his profile. The jaw, the dark eyes tracking the coastal highway, the hands easy on the wheel in a way she had never seen in the city. She felt something move through her chest with the slow, certain warmth of something that had been building for months and had finally found room to expand. She turned back to the ocean. "Okay," she said softly. The house sat above the water on a bluff, surrounded by cypress trees that had been permanently bent sideways by decades of coastal wind. It was not large, nothing like the Commonwealth Avenue penthouse, but it had windows that faced the Pacific on 3 sides and a wraparound veranda where the sound of the ocean was constant and close, and the air smelled of cold stone and salt and something living. They arrived as the afternoon was turning toward evening, the light shifting from gold to something deeper and more amber, the kind that exists only at that specific hour on the California coast, and that painters have spent centuries unsuccessfully trying to capture. Chelsea walked straight through the house and out to the veranda without stopping. She stood at the railing with her hands resting on the weathered wood, her face turned toward the water. She was wearing a rust-colored linen jacket over a simple white shirt, and the coastal wind moved through her hair the way it moved through the cypress trees, with the easy authority of something that owned the air. Leon stood in the doorway behind her and watched for a moment. The way the wind moved her, the stillness of her posture, the quality of attention she brought to the ocean, the same way she brought it to everything, complete, unperformed. He went back inside and opened the bottle of wine he had thought to bring. They had dinner on the veranda as the sun went down. Simple food from a local market, eaten without ceremony. The conversation moved in the easy, unhurried way it had developed over months of shared mornings and long evenings, between things that mattered and things that didn't, with the fluid naturalness of people who had stopped editing themselves around each other. Chelsea told him about the first time she had seen the Pacific. She had been 23, a semester research exchange, standing on a beach in Oregon in October with rain coming sideways, feeling, inexplicably, completely at home. Leon told her about his father. Not the version he gave interviews. Not the carefully managed narrative of a legacy honored and continued. The real version. The complicated man who had been brilliant and careless in equal measure. Who had loved his son in ways that didn't always look like love, but were, underneath the difficulty, entirely genuine. It was the most he had ever said about his father to another person. To anyone. Chelsea listened with the quality of attention that was one of the most extraordinary things about her. Not passive, not merely polite, but genuinely and completely present, receiving what was given with a care that made honesty feel like something other than exposure. When he finished, she didn't offer comfort or analysis. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Briefly, the way someone places a hand on something precious, not to claim it, just to acknowledge it. He turned his hand over and held hers. The stars appeared gradually as the sky deepened over the Pacific. The temperature dropped with the particular efficiency of coastal nights. At some point Leon stood and held out his hand to her with a quiet directness that required no explanation. "Dance with me," he said. Chelsea looked at the empty veranda, the weathered boards, the cypress trees moving in the dark, the ocean enormous beyond the railing. "There's no music," she said. "I know," he said. She took his hand. They moved slowly, the way people move when there is no rhythm to follow except the one they make together. Close, unhurried, her head finding its way to his chest with the ease of something that had always belonged there. His arms came around her, and she felt the tension that lived permanently in his shoulders release gradually, like something long held given permission to set itself down. Below the bluff, the ocean worked its patient repetition against the rocks. The cypress trees moved in the dark. The stars continued their indifferent and magnificent burning. Leon pressed his lips to her hair briefly. Then he spoke, his voice low against her temple. The voice that belonged only to her. The voice she had first heard in a snowed-in living room and had understood then was the truest instrument the man possessed. "I came to the altar to fulfill an obligation," he said. I signed the contract because I had no better option. I told myself it was a business arrangement, and I was competent to manage it. A pause. The ocean filling the silence between his words. I was wrong about almost everything. Chelsea was still against him, listening with her whole self. I stayed. He continued, quieter still. Because you are the only thing in my life that I cannot manage, optimize, or reduce to a variable. And I spent 40 years believing that control was the point. His arms tightened slightly around her, an involuntary emphasis. So you are the first thing that has made me genuinely grateful to be wrong. Chelsea lifted her face from his chest. She looked up at him, the California sky enormous behind him, the cypress trees dark against the stars. Her eyes were clear and warm and entirely without distance. I know, she said softly, not dismissively, with the fullness of someone who has known for a long time and has been waiting patiently, without ultimatum, for the knowledge to travel from one person to the other. Chapter 13. Everything Worth Keeping. He looked at her face in the starlight, at the eyes he had spent months trying to file into a category they refused to fit, at the mouth that said true things in few words, at the woman who had sat at a kitchen table with a contract and a cold cup of coffee, told an empty room she knew exactly who she was, and had been right, completely, and without revision, ever since. He touched her face with both hands, the way he had in the living room on that March night, but differently now, not in the compressed urgency of something breaking open, in the quiet deliberateness of someone who has arrived and knows it. The kiss that followed was nothing like the first one. It was not a confession or a collision or the release of something long pressurized. It was something simpler and more complete. Two people who had seen each other clearly, without performance, without the convenient distance of contracts and categories and carefully maintained walls, and had chosen, with full information, to stay. When they parted, he kept his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. The ocean below continued its ancient, patient work. He smiled. Not the controlled half-curve he offered boardrooms. Not the polite social expression that appeared in photographs. The real one. The rare, unguarded, entirely genuine thing that arrived only when he was caught off guard by something worth smiling at. The one that Chelsea had been, without strategy or intention, slowly drawing out of him for months. She felt it against her forehead before she saw it. When she pulled back slightly and looked at him, this man smiling in the dark above the Pacific, like someone who had just discovered something he hadn't known he was looking for. She thought about her father's quiet words from years ago, about a world that sometimes needed time to be ready. Maybe he'd been right, she thought. Not because she needed protection, but because some things were worth waiting for until the time was exactly and entirely correct. The wind moved through the cypress trees. The stars burned on. Leon Noble stood on a veranda above the California coast with his forehead pressed to Chelsea Potter's and his arms around her, and the smile that only she had ever found. The ocean below said nothing at all, the way oceans do when everything that needs to be said has finally, completely, been said. He had come to the altar believing he knew exactly what he was getting. A contract, a name on a document, a woman the world had never bothered to look at twice. But when the veil fell, so did every wall he had spent a lifetime building. Because the most extraordinary things rarely announce themselves. They wait quietly, steadily, for someone finally brave enough to look. Some people enter our lives through doors we never chose to open, and somehow they become the reason we're grateful the door existed at all. Leon Noble had walked into a cathedral with a contract and walked out with something he had no category for, no filing system adequate to contain, no strategy designed to manage. He walked out with Chelsea, and that was the most precise and complete thing that could be said about any of it. The rest was the life they built together, on their own terms, in their own time, entirely outside the original agreement, and entirely, permanently, real. If today's story melted your heart or helped you relax through the day's tasks, Hit that like button and comment where you're watching from, as this channel needs all your love and support to continue growing. And if you're new here, please subscribe and join the Lovers and Billionaires family. Because around here, love is priceless and the stories are heart-melting. See you on the next one.